Sorry, I've been slightly oversold there because I'm not going to teach you anything about storytelling. In fact, perhaps slightly to the contrary. Safety as a profession is shaped by the stories that we tell. Arguably, our discipline was founded in the creeping deaths of the Industrial Revolution. It was forged in the explosions at Bhopal and Piper Alpha, and in the wastelands that surrounded Chernobyl. All of the big ideas we have in safety are rightly or wrongly linked to major accidents. We can't think about safety cases without talking about Piper Alpha. We can't talk about safety culture without talking about Chernobyl. When you want to justify why we need leading indicators, people talk about the BP explosions at Texas City. Now, safety is not unusual in being a profession that uses lots of stories. But the stories we tell are kind of different to the stories that other people tell. If you're a lawyer, you talk about great law cases. If you're an engineer, you talk about giant monuments or innovations. The stories that other disciplines have all have heroes. And in safety, our stories don't. Our stories have villains and they have victims. And even when it comes to things like researching what works in safety, if you start digging down into the evidence behind a lot of our safety practices, there's no real empiricism there. What there is reinterpretation of past events. We use stories of the past to tell us what we should have done, and then we turn those into stories about the future, what we should do instead, or bad things are going to happen. And what I find most sinister is we don't just do this with the big accidents. We don't just do this with the explosions and the crashing planes and the trains that fall off the tracks. We do it with very human stories as well. We figuratively, and sometimes quite literally, drag out maimed and injured people as object moral lessons in the ways people should behave. We say, this is what happens to you if you don't follow the instructions. So, stories of the past, stories of the future. Essentially what we're doing, we're drawing upon the ghosts of disaster past and the spectres of disaster future. And we're using it to justify the bureaucracy we want to put into the present. So, take these things, they sound very technical when we want to talk about quantitative risk assessment or incident classification. And imagine yourself instead in a village with a prophet. I stand before you and I tell you that you are all doomed. Don't believe me? Look at that village down the road. I went and I prophesied in their village, and what happened? Disaster struck. And disaster will strike your village too, unless you appease the gods of safety. What do the gods of safety need to be appeased? Well, don't worry, I very conveniently have the answer. It's going to take a little bit of money on your part. It's not an easy job being the intermediary to the gods. It's going to take some sacrifices. We'll take some people who've made poor choices and we'll sacrifice them. And I'm going to need a big stack of 3-ring binders. For some reason, the gods of safety demand the sacrifice of lots and lots of paper. Now, just in case you think I'm being a little bit melodramatic and I'm exaggerating here about the nature of safety and the nature of these stories, I'm about 4 doors down, strangely enough located in a school of humanities, from a group of people who study cave paintings from 15,000 years ago. And so I get to go along to PhD presentations for my own students and PhD presentations from people who wander around Indonesia looking at ancient rituals. And the scary, scary thing is, the research methods are almost identical because the types of things that they're looking at are almost identical. These are ritualized social practices that people put in place in order to alleviate the discomfort and the uncertainty and the insecurity that they're feeling. And whether it's the anthropologists and the 15,000-year-old cave paintings, or it's the people today, you give it sophisticated sounding names to make it seem as if it is more real, more technical. But it's all based upon story. Now, I don't want you to think that I'm against a good story. In fact, those of you who know what I spend a lot of my spare time doing, I'd be pretty hypocritical if I was saying don't tell stories about disasters. Have you heard the one about the Great Molasses Flood? True story, Boston, 1919, 5-story high tank, painted brown because it leaked. And as long as it's painted brown, you can't see the molasses leaks. Kids used to run along the side of this tank with sticks, and they'd collect the leaking molasses like fairy floss to eat. And then one particularly warm day, fermenting molasses, bit of gas, we start hearing rivets popping like machine gun fire. And we've got a whole bunch of returned veterans hanging around, so they're all diving for cover thinking that they're being shot at. Followed by an explosion, followed by a 25-foot-high wall of molasses, moving at 60 kilometres an hour. Now, that gets people's attention. It leads into conversations about the role of expertise, oversight, project management. I love a good story, and they're great for teaching safety. In fact, I kind of think they're better than virtual reality simulations, because a story can help someone generate the picture inside their own mind instead of outside the mind. It gets people to engage. It can help them over threshold concepts, understanding the real problems that people faced, getting away from hindsight to think, what was it like for the people in these situations with the information they had? But it's easy for me to do this because I don't spend my time out in the workplace. I'm an educator. That's my job. And I don't think that the stories we tell within companies have quite that same pure motivation that I have when I tell pure disaster stories. I think mostly we tell stories simply in order to motivate people through fear. We tell them bad things will happen and use the story simply to say, watch out for the bad things, follow my solutions. Now, as a way of getting people to do things, motivation through fear is wrong. I'll say that just as a moral absolute. Motivation through fear is wrong. And then as an educator, I'll say motivation through fear is stupid. It's the kind of strategy that parents use after they've given up on all those parenting strategies that actually work. And they're down to that point where they just want to vent their frustration instead of trying to get their kid to do what they want. Now, it may surprise you, but there is a whole science behind safety motivation. There are decades of research into what makes the perfect safety poster. These, by the way, are not examples of stuff coming out of this research. The third one's my favourite, the poster telling you to look at the posters. Now, I would advise you do not go away and research safety posters, because it will only irritate you. It's like learning about fonts and kerning. Once you know what these things are supposed to look like when they're well designed, you just see all the bad examples everywhere. And there's one universal that comes out of research into safety motivation that comes across the whole spread of the research. No safety motivation project has ever been demonstrated to actually improve safety. And the simple reason is that the problem has never been motivation. Now, anyone who's sitting back thinking, hold on, I've got a project, bring me the evidence, please. Because we use this when we're teaching our students into critical thought, is we give them the so-called evidence behind these things and we get them to tear it apart. And we'll happily do that for you as a free service and hand it back to you. Now, the problem here, the reason why people head towards these strange practices, is, I think, a confusion between management and leadership. And it's the difference between getting people to buy into something and getting them to own it. We talk about them as equivalents, as if you can get someone to embrace an idea just by persuading them how great and important that idea is. Now, simple trick. If you really want to know what a leader cares about, ignore all of the things that they're saying and just focus on the questions that they're asking. Because people talk about the things they think you want to hear or the things they think you should hear. People ask questions about the things that they're interested in. So leaders, good leaders, are the ones who are genuinely interested in finding out things about work. Now, this isn't going to be one of those talks that finishes with some message about how safety is supposed to be about learning about work. I wanted to make it a little bit more practical than that. So I'm going to dive now into some of the detail. How do you actually conduct a positive investigation? How do you find out about the positive things at work? Now, this is going to be, like many safety processes, 3 steps. And this template applies to any safety process. There's a step where you get data, there's a step where you analyse data, and there's a step where you use the data. The difference is the people applying this method are going to be the whole time remembering that they're not the experts in anything except asking questions. They're not there to fix, they're not there to find solutions, they're not there to analyse and solve problems. One of the things we've found is that organisations start off with this lovely idea, let's investigate positive things. So they collect positive stories of success, and then they analyse those positive stories of success and notice all the places things could have gone wrong and point out all of the variations and all of the non-compliances. And very soon, positive investigations just become another way of telling workers what they should have been doing. So, step 1, asking questions. What sort of questions elicit good stories? If I want to find out about bricklaying, and let me make this clear, I know nothing about bricklaying except that it's this thing that involves bricks. So how do I get good stories about bricklaying? Well, I find a bricklayer and I ask them things like, who's the best bricklayer you knew when you were an apprentice? I'm looking for a hero, someone that they can tell me about. Because when you're talking about a person, you're going to be telling stories. And this lets me understand things like what actually makes a good bricklayer. Who do bricklayers look up to, and what do they choose in those people to see as relevant and important? Now, there's a whole set of different types of question patterns like this. It's something that we do need to investigate better empirically. At the moment, we know a lot of different organisations that are trying out different questions, and we're just in the process of gathering those questions and trying to get some ideas for what works and what doesn't. So we can ask questions that elicit stories about success. Here's a really simple one. Which day last week was the best? Now, in theory, according to the procedures, all days are the same. So tell me a story about which day was the best last week. Here again, we have clues. What is a good day? What counts as a good day? What are the sorts of things that you recognise when you're deciding whether it was a good day or not? And what do you think made it that way? Tell me about the project you're most proud of. Again, getting a story, what counts as success on a project? Are you proud because it finished on time, because of your own contribution, because of the difficulty? Stories about learning what success is. And then we can ask questions that get stories about the things that lead to success. Look for where work is variable. Now, how do you get a story about variable work? You don't say, when's the last time you varied from the procedure? You don't say, when's the last time you deviated? Those aren't the sorts of things that get people talking. But you ask them, when's the last time you helped someone out? Or when's the last time someone helped you out? Because according to the procedures, there's no helping out, there's no getting stuck. So this is variation. What are you proud of about the way you do a job that you'd like other people to learn? Again, looking for variation. Stories about how people do tasks differently. When was the last time you got stuck on a job and you had to improvise in order to meet the goals? Looking for variation. We can ask stories that get people to talk about what they depend on to do good work. So when was the last time you got really frustrated? What brought that about? Simply, what do you depend on to get the job done? Now, tell me a story about when that wasn't there. Now, there is a slight drawback to this sort of questioning process, in that you're basically giving people permission to gripe. And people who've tried out these sorts of investigations, very quickly they find that people just start telling them about bad leaders, bad management, bad tools, bad equipment, bad days. And again, the strategy is to come back to turning things into specific stories. Okay, so you're telling me that you've never got the right tools. I hear what you're saying, you're frustrated about tools.
You're boring me there, walking too close to the edge. You've got to stand behind. That's the limit, okay? Sorry,
Someone has been working on their hazard identification skills. That's 1%. Certainly, shall I look out for biological hazards as well, sources of major energy?
What do you reckon? Are there anything else?
Dust particles, electricity, noise.
I've gone through that checklist myself, and it was just the
Just the edge?
Just the edge. Was
Thank you.
The only one I've got. Carry on. Sorry.
So we turn the story about a grudge into a story about specific. You tell me about a time when you didn't have the right tools. What brought it about? How was that managed? Okay, so I hear you telling me that you think that the real reason this project was a success was that Dave was such a great leader. Okay, well, tell me about a time when the project really needed Dave to get them past a problem, or tell me about a time when you really relied on Dave. I hear you telling me that the big issue here was relations with the customer. Okay, tell me about a really good engagement with the customer. Tell me about a really difficult engagement with the customer. Turning gripes into specific stories. So that's step one, gathering the information. Step two, analysis. Now, the ideal here would simply be to get people to analyse their own stories. I think Daniel later is going to tell us about simply putting all the stories up on a wall and getting teams to walk around classifying them, grouping them together. But whatever process is used, essentially what we're doing is using the organisation to do qualitative research on itself. So we don't need to take the stories and turn them into data. The stories are data. Simply gathering those stories and communicating them within the organisation, instead of going to the board meeting and saying we've got a problem with tooling, saying this is the issue with tooling, here are several specific stories of things that happened on particular sites involving tools, is a much more persuasive message, and it's a much more evidenced, reasoned message. Now, here's the really hard step. This is the complicated one. This is the one that's difficult to implement. Step 3 in the process. You collect the data, you analyse the data, you walk away. Now, that's kind of a hard sell for safety practitioners. Because I don't know about you, but I got into the business because I wanted to make people safer. Because I had ideas, There were things that I could identify that other people couldn't identify. There were solutions that I could come up with that other people couldn't come up with. There is no particular reason to believe that a safety practitioner can tell someone who is not a safety practitioner how that person should do their own job better than that person can come up with for itself. The expertise that safety people have is not in finding solutions. Now, if some of those examples I was giving about methods of collecting stories or of turning gripes into stories sounded a bit like people at a counselling session, that's because that's the type of skills that a safety practitioner needs in order to move towards a positive way of doing safety. Expertise in asking questions, expertise in listening to the answers, expertise in taking those stories, amplifying them, passing them on, but not expertise in finding solutions. There are many, many different schools of thought in safety. You can call them cults, you can call them paradigms, you can call them schools of research, schools of thought, subdisciplines. They disagree with each other on pretty much every fundamental, from what to measure to what to do about it. But there's actually one thing they all agree on, and that is that an organisation which understands itself better is safer. By collecting stories about the organisation and spreading those stories within the organisation, a safety practitioner has fixed things. They have taken a direct step that makes work better. They've done it without writing a procedure, without motivating anyone, without scaring anyone, simply by being there, collecting stories, listening to stories, hearing those stories, passing those stories on. And the accumulated sum of what is collected there are not tales of disaster. They're tales of things that are really interesting about work. It is a lot more fun finding out how exactly someone drills a particular type of explosive hole and fills it than it is watching them do it and writing a little tick on a box based on whether they're wearing a helmet or not while they're doing it. It's fascinating to learn about work in all its variety. It's a fun job, it's an exciting job, and it's a positive job. I don't think we're going to be able to get old school safety practitioners to suddenly stop doing safety. But what we can do is give them something to do instead, something that uses their expertise, uses their accumulated knowledge. Safety as a profession is shaped by the stories we tell. If we want to do safety differently, then what we need to do is start telling different stories.